Hey all, welcome to the GATE Equity webinar series. I'm Kathy Anderson, System Improvement Program Supervisor Lead, and today we're talking about culturally responsive positive behavior intervention and supports. This meeting is being recorded and it should be available immediately on YouTube. It's being live streamed. It has closed captionings that are available in the menu if you want to take advantage of that. The PowerPoint is also posted on the OSPI Graduation Equity webinar page. So if you want to follow along, that'll be there, and we're going to get it for you in the chat as well. This webinar is brought to you through the Office of Student Engagement and Supports within the Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction. At OSPI, we believe each student needs to be prepared for post-secondary pathways, careers, and civic engagement. The Graduation Equity webinar series was created with the purpose of highlighting practices that increase access to education and ultimately to graduation. Through these webinars, we're trying to go beyond equality, to think about the opportunities that we have to examine and dismantle current policies and practices that result in disparate outcomes for our students. And we have the ultimate goal of ensuring that each student has access to the instruction and support that will make them successful in school and in life. We want to acknowledge historical context and engage our students, families, and communities as partners in decision-making to create the kind of schools that we know kids will thrive in. Today, I want to share with you this ancestral lands overlapping map. I like this map because it's more informative about the lands that we live on in Washington, and it provides additional context for our communities to consider. I love the nuance of seeing that these lands are often shared by multiple groups and that the borders aren't always clear, they overlap. And we ask that the participants of this meeting honor the traditional lands on which each of you are located today, and we'll paste some links in the chat to help. In my life, I mostly travel around the intersection of the traditional lands of the Squaxin Island, Coast Salish, Cowlitz, and Nisqually tribes. And I'd like to acknowledge the Indigenous people who have stewarded this land since time immemorial and who still inhabit the area today. Tribal consultation is a really great way to get to know your local tribes and begin relationships that benefit students and their families. So if you'd like to know more about that, we would love to connect you with our Office of Native Education. If you don't know it already, y'all are leaders and you have the power to signal other people. We all know that schools have a huge impact on our students and that the decisions that the adults make often have a lasting impact. We want to encourage you to consider where you have influence and what you can do to help each student find success. At OSPI, we're partnering with Nika White Consulting to find out what we can do better. They've done an analysis through surveys and focus groups to come up with some specific ways that OSPI can improve that are going to help us move in the right direction and measure our growth. I'm constantly looking at the evidence around OSPI so that we're doing equity work. And I wanted to point out this example of how our leadership is being transparent with our staff about where we stand and where we're heading as an agency. At our most recent all-staff meeting, our leadership team shared with us the demographics of our staff and some graphs of our hiring practices. And I'm proud to say that in the past year, OSPI has hired 38% people of color. I also wanted to share that they highlighted for us that our beginning educators of color make up 23% of our teaching workforce, which has trended up since 2016. And the 5-year trend is that we are increasingly hiring educators of color as a state. And while this is a positive and good move for us, we know that we have a long way to go. And we're moving to increase the diversity of our teaching force, something that we know signals to students that they belong in school. So kudos to them. We chose culturally responsive PBIS today because we know that October is a good time to take stock of which students need supports. The most visible students have made themselves known at this time of year, and your systems are probably going to get tested. And we know that this year is, it's been especially hard for students and educators with the added stress of transitioning back after a year and a half out of school, and in some places, as well as the continuing concerns about the pandemic and how it affects schools. So it's a great time to beef up strategies that honor our students and communities and continue to build on positive relationships. We're hoping our webinar today can help you learn foundational system strategies for centering equity and culturally responsive practices for positive behavior interventions and supports. And we've enlisted the guidance of Dr. Ruthie Pino-Simmons to help set a vision for what that might look like. You'll also get the benefit of firsthand experience on building a system for culturally responsive positive behavior interventions and supports with Clover Park's Jonathan Love. And we've also got some great resources that we think will help you think whole child this school year. I'm joined today by my colleagues from OSPI. I've got Dua Ka, our School Climate Transformation Grant Program Supervisor, as well as Akiva Erazim, our Continuous Improvement Program Specialist. Dua and Akiva are equity leaders at OSPI and have brought with them today Dr. Ruthie Pino-Simmons. Dr. Pino-Simmons is the founder and CEO of RPS Educational Impact, and she serves as an equity specialist for the Michigan MTSS TA Center and state cadre specialist for the Midwest and Plains Equity Assistance Center, that's the MAP Center, at Indiana University, Purdue University in Indianapolis, excuse me. Dr. Pino-Simmons provides consulting and technical assistance for various state and local education entities. Her work involves collaborating with teams of experts at the state and national level and providing professional learning supportive and of developing policies and strategic planning to address significant academic and discipline disproportionality involving students who have been historically and systemically marginalized. Dr. Pino-Simmons supports educators and policymakers in considering ways to center race, culture, power, and educational equity as they work to build and strengthen their educational systems. Dr. Pino-Simmons' experience as a parent, researcher, teacher, educator, principal, and central office administrator has provided her with a broad depth of knowledge and expertise in culturally sustaining practices, multi-tiered systems of support, school-wide positive behavior supports, and implementing sustainable educational systems. In her role as building principal, Dr. Pino-Simmons worked with her staff to implement sustainable systems that focused on promoting equitable learning, which earned the state designation of Reward School for closing the opportunity gap between the top 30% and bottom 30% of students performing on the state assessment. Dr. Pino-Simmons' leadership experiences over the last decade include policy analysis and strategic planning, coordination of K-12 educational programs, instruction, curriculum, staff, professional development at all levels, school improvements, district accreditation, and evaluation of systems, assessment, and processes. This is one impressive lady, let me tell you. Dua and Akiva have also brought with them Jonathan Love from Clover Park School District. Clover Park has been building a comprehensive system for culturally responsive PBIS, and we wanted him to be able to share some of what they're doing with you today. We do like to get to know our audience so that we can tailor our content to who is in the room. So we're going to launch a poll here to take a look at your role, what is your grade band, and how familiar you are with the topic. And we'll just take a look. And in the chat, I'm seeing lots of awesome folks with us this morning. Great to see y'all. And it looks like we have quite a few counselors with us this morning. We've got a handful of administrators. We've got a good amount of district office or ESD or OSPI folks with us as well. And if you're in that other category, you can tell us in the chat what your role is. That's great. We've got quite a few of middle or high school. We've got some both elementary, and people are somewhat familiar with this topic. So I think that we can go kind of deep, y'all. Sounds great. Well, we like to start with data. So for those of you who don't know, in place of the Healthy Youth Survey this last year, students took the COVID-19 survey. And it helps to give education leaders an idea of how they're doing mentally and physically in our state. And it's going to be offered again this year, and you can see the full results online. But Dua, I believe that you've got some fun facts for us. So Dua, can you tell us a little bit about what stood out to you in the results?
Definitely. Thank you, Kathy. So yes, before we begin, let's look at some data first from the COVID-19 student survey to understand why a school-wide culturally responsive, positive behavioral interventions and supports is so important, especially right now as we are transitioning back to in-person learning. So we pulled two statistics to share today that we felt were important, including how 36% of students reported feeling safer from bullying when school was online compared to when school was in person. Notably, students identifying as LGBTQ+ and students identifying as having a disability were more likely to report feeling safer when school was online. And additionally, more than 2/3, so 67% of the high school students who completed the survey reported that they are actually trying their best during the past year. Trying their best, however, was slightly less common among students identifying as LGBTQ. So now that we have these two statistics, right, what does this all mean and how does this relate to culturally responsive PBIS? And knowing that students, especially those who identify as LGBTQ+ and those identifying as having a disability, felt safer online rather than in person, we need to really address how to make our schools safer for our students as they return to in-person learning. We cannot go back to the way we were before because it didn't work, and it will not continue to work unless we address structural and school-wide changes. Additionally, we know how much of an impact COVID-19 has been on everyone's mental health and well-being. And yes, 67% of our students are still trying their best. This demonstrates their resiliencies and tenacity, even during difficult and unprecedented times. This is why culturally responsive PBIS is so crucial. Our students are not giving up, and we cannot either. We need to really nurture and support them as they transition and navigate back to in-person learning, which not always be perfect, neither for us as adults. So instead of focusing on just disciplinary actions and deficit assumptions, let's focus instead on building authentic relationships and model healthy practices and routines to avoid burnout for both students and staff. And with that being said, let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Ruthie Panos-Simmons, our keynote speaker of the day.
Good morning, everyone. Just a quick second here so that I can share my screen. All right, here we go. Thank you for your patience. So first of all, thank you so much for having me in your space today. I want to bid you a very good morning. And I want to let you know that I believe truly that all of your futures are bright and that the work that you do has profound impact on students and on the community. And I believe that the possibilities and opportunities to create solutions and systems that benefit every student, and I want to say each and every student, towards self-determination, they're in your hands, they're in my hands, they're in our hands. And so that's what brings me into this space today. And I know that this is a part of what brings you today. So we're going to talk about shifting our gaze to create culturally sustaining PBIS systems and practices. Quickly, I want to acknowledge that I work with the Midwest and Plains Equity Assistance Center. I do a lot of work with the National TA Center for Positive Behavior Supports. I currently serve on their equity work group. I just recently joined the significant disproportionality work group at the national level. And we do a lot of work within our TA Center here in Michigan in partnership with the TA Center. And our center here in Michigan, we focus on implementing multi-tiered systems of support. And we're at the heart of really considering what does it mean to center equity and all of the work that we do as TA providers, and how do we support our partners. And so across these different hats that I wear, because I wear a lot of hats, you're going to hear learning coming from these different places today that I have engaged in, and also that informs what you see here today. I also wanted to start with a quote that has had a profound impact on me and tells a little bit of my story as well. So Alicia Garza is one of the co-founders of Black Lives Matter, and she wrote a book called The Purpose of Power: How We Come Together When We Fall Apart. And she was recently interviewed by Jemele Hill. And when she was interviewed, she said some pretty profound things. But the most profound thing that stuck with me as I listened was when she was asked, what do you want people to do or get out of this book when they're reading it? And she said, I want people to put themselves in the book. I want people to ask themselves the same questions that I am asking myself. How did we get here? How was I shaped? Why do I believe what I believe? What was going on around me when I was growing up that shaped my view of the world? And how does that impact how I do or do not take action today? So she's got these questions that she's asking, and I'm a person who's driven by questions. I've been asking questions since I can remember. And so today I'm going to tell you a story, and I want you to place yourself in that story that I'm going to tell. And I want this session to be a part of the journey that each of you are on towards realizing equitable experiences and outcomes for all students, but especially for our Black and Brown students and our students with disabilities that we see showing up in the data. And I don't want to leave any group of students that's been marginalized out of this conversation. So we want to make sure we're thinking about who's showing up in our data and how do we make sure we're thinking about their stories. And today I want you to think about this talk as a tool that you can leverage in your work for social justice and education as you seek to center equity in PBIS practices. And I want you to use this information and these tools and the resources. There's a handout that you have with a whole list of resources that informs a lot of what I'm going to talk through today that you can use, but also share with others. So that's my little beautiful chocolate face there. I was born in 1971. And just by being born into the assigned race of being Black and African-American, I could even say in being female, I was on the school to pipeline trajectory, the school to prison pipeline trajectory. Before I could walk, before I could talk, before I could read, before I even understood what it meant to behave, my aspirations and outcomes were being determined. And that's because when I was a child, Black and Brown kids in 1973 who looked like me were suspended 2 times more than their white peers. And I know you all are familiar with this data, but I wanted to put my story and superimpose my story on this data because it helps to understand how my own thoughts and my ideas and my worldview has been shaped over the years. And my questions. Did you all know that Black and Brown preschool students were suspended and are suspended and referred to law enforcement at a disproportionate rate compared to white preschool students? There was a study done by Gillian in 2016 that showed that preschool teachers are more likely in a very subconscious way to look for signs of challenging behaviors of young Black children, and especially Black boys compared to their white male counterparts. So even though I escaped the strong possibility of becoming a school to pipeline statistic, it wasn't without setbacks, and it wasn't without having a lot of doors closed. It was not without being denied access to opportunities that were afforded to many of my white counterparts. And it was not without losing critical parts of my identity, my self socially and culturally. I often tell my colleagues when we're engaging in these courageous conversations around equity that I've had to give up a lot of who I am to be where I am today. And I'm actually in the phases, I turned 50 in May this year, and I am in the process of reclaiming a lot of those things. And so that's important to think about when we think about the structures in which our kids learn in. But before we get to that, I want to talk about some conditions in which I learned. I am a proud graduate of Detroit Public Schools. I live in the Lansing, Michigan area, but I grew up in Detroit, Michigan. And so that's my high school. And as I matriculated through the K-12 system, many of my teachers were white. Just to give you some of those conditions. In the textbooks that I learned from were filled with white history and culture. The social studies books and history books were filled with history from that focused on dominant culture and white culture. And when I saw people who looked like me, it was the same 3 individuals, and it was only for 1 month out of a year. I'm pretty sure if many of you think about Black History Month, if you had that in your schooling experience, or as you look at your K-12 history, you'll see probably that these are 3 individuals, great individuals that you might recognize. But these were the 3 that I saw over and over again over a 12, 13-year period in my educational experience. And so that impacted me in a profound way. Additionally, another condition that I experienced was that I wasn't encouraged to pursue college. I remember talking with my guidance counselor and saying, I want to go to college, I want to be a doctor. At that point, I thought I wanted to be a medical doctor. And I was told, why would why don't you consider doing hair or maybe majoring in cosmetology? And don't get me wrong, I can do hair really well. I grew up in Detroit in the salons. So I watched over the years how hair was done, but I really wanted to do work in a different way. And I had a vision for myself, and the vision I had for myself didn't match with the vision that my school had for me. And so that impacted me and some of the questions that I had along the way as a result of all of those conditions in which I was learning and those conditions in which my teachers were teaching. I started asking, why don't prominent historical figures look like me? Did only a few people who look like me make important contributions to society? What is wrong with Black people? What's wrong with me? I really thought something was wrong with me because I lived in Black skin, because of the ways in which the world was shaped around me at that point in my life. I knew I wanted to be a doctor and I knew I wanted to go to college, but I had real doubts about if I'd be able to achieve that. Would I graduate from high school? Would I be a successful adult? So I say these things to say that students are thinking about these types of things and asking these questions all the time. And the conditions in which they're learning, they really do shape how they're thinking and how their questions form and change over time. I want to share a critical positive moment that I had in high school in 9th grade, where I had English teacher, Mrs. Cunningham, who was amazing. It was the first time that I was able to engage and see someone who looked like me doing the kinds of things that inspired me to see myself as a Black female in a more positive light. And so I followed this teacher. After finishing 9th grade, I found out she was going to be teaching drama, and I took drama for the next 4 years. And she got involved in my life and played a significant role in shaping some of my identity. And I contribute a lot of her energy to me being here and in this space today. Another teacher that I want to highlight is Mr. Lewis. In 11th grade, Mr. Lewis would teach American history, and I believe I had him like at 5th or 6th hour. And for those of you who are teaching at the secondary level, you know that's when the temptation comes to leave a little bit early. Maybe after your 5th hour class, go down to Burger King, as many of my friends and I had even done before. But after getting into 11th grade and seeing and hearing about history that I hadn't heard about, I was in that classroom every day and literally at the edge of my seat, because he was saying things about people who look like me and how they contributed to our society and our history. And that really captured my imagination. And can you imagine that I'd begun to hear about a very different history in 11th grade? So much so that it really pushed me to begin to think about majoring in history when I moved from K-12 into college. And so I majored in history in undergrad, and I had some additional critical moments. It opened my eyes to truths that I didn't know about. I began to be more empowered, and as I learned more about systems of oppression in our history. Majoring in history had a major impact also on the way that I taught when I moved into teaching as a novice teacher. I learned some really interesting things, such as Black people who were freed Black people living in this country and in the colonies before the Mayflower. Never heard that learning in my classroom. Learning about women fighting for rights and writing up their own declaration of sentiments so that they could attain the same types of freedom, access to the same types of freedoms that men had. I didn't know that. I didn't know that there were these intersections between race and gender and how that positioned us as women across the race lines, and even those who were actually fighting for the freedom of enslaved individuals, Black individuals. I also did not know, I was really surprised when I learned that the first Black senator and representatives were African Americans were senators and representatives were Republican. I didn't know that growing up. So these were things that I learned that really shifted my questions along the way. And I started to ask, how can I ensure that students of all backgrounds see current and historical figures that look like them? How can I facilitate student learning and cultivate critical consciousness? How can I infuse multicultural literature across the content areas? These were questions I was asking in my pre-service teaching learning, and also as I was engaging in professional learning as a classroom teacher. How can I help people interrogate their conceptions of Black people? and what's wrong with people and their thinking, and how did they get there? The article that you see, hopefully to the left of your screen, it says From Answers to Questions, chronicles some of my earlier teaching, where a lot of the planning and facilitation of the classroom practices were culturally responsive and sustaining. At least that's what I was aiming for. In particular, I wanted to begin thinking about how allowing my students inquiry questions could guide an entire integrated social studies and literacy unit from start to end. Excuse me. And you can see some of the questions that are there. I can tell you that as the students' questions guided the unit, these fifth graders that I worked with in this particular article, they went on to have really in-depth conversations about the world around them, around worldviews, around their current worldviews, and around how they were being influenced by that, as they engaged in their own research and learning about issues they were interested in that were tied back to our scope and sequence for our curriculum in our district. As I moved into my classroom in the 1990s, the late 1990s, I observed Black students being often sent to the office, suspended, and I would even say Black and brown students, and also being labeled and sent into the hallways. In 1995, I became a new mom of this, my firstborn, this beautiful young man who's now 26 years old. And although I was educated and achieved middle class status, and my son had both parents in the home, he faced a similar reality of mine at birth. Before he was even able to talk, walk, behave, read, his aspirations and outcomes were being determined by systems of oppression that not only were determining his possible future, but were also influencing who we are as educators, how we come to know what we know, do what we do, and how we create and implement systems that our students experience as they matriculate through their K-12 educational journey. And that's because in 2006, Black and brown students who look like my son were suspended 3 times more likely than their white peers. So that represented, from my time of being in school to my son's time of being on this planet, 25 years of systemic discipline inequities. And so today, when we look at those systemic inequities, we can see that African-American students are now 4 times more likely to be suspended than their white peers, which represents 40 years of inequitable discipline practices. And so we have to begin to ask ourselves why that's happening. And so some of the shifts in my questions now, in my current role, in the multiple hats that I wear, how do I continue to interrogate my own biases and assumptions? Because I now understand that through my own social conditioning, through my own experiences, there are ways in which I've internalized systems of oppression. And so how am I making sure that I'm addressing those things as I'm engaging in internal and reflection of self? How can I help teachers and administrators do the same thing? How can I help them understand issues of bias and systems of oppression? How can I ensure that all students have access to equitable educational opportunities? And how can I help educators and schools and communities interrogate their conceptions of Black people and other individuals from non-dominant cultures? And so I want to start by grounding this talk in what I mean by educational equity. Educational equity is when educational policies and practices and interactions and resources are representative of, constructed by, and responsive to all people, so that each individual has access to meaningfully participate in and have positive outcomes from high quality learning experiences, regardless of individual characteristics and group memberships. And so if you can see on the screen there are 4 core concepts that the Midwest and Plains Equity Assistance Center uses to define and to leverage for systems when we're talking about educational equity. So when we think about access, access is really all students having this entrance into and involvement with and the full benefit of quality learning opportunities. It's not the same as availability. Representation, when we think about that, or access, is not just about it's there and people can access it. It's about really understanding, is it truly accessible for all different types of students from all walks of life? When we think about representation, it's really related to all students and families, regardless of identity markers, having presence in the decision-making and the content that they're going to be experiencing and in the systems that are going to be put in place. Educational equity, when we think about representation, it's more than about diversity and inclusion. It really is about educational justice and about redistributing power and resources, and collecting survey data, which is a really good start, is not enough. It really is about making sure that at every level where decisions are being made and systems are being designed and implemented, that we have multiple and diverse stakeholders participating in that decision making. When we think about meaningful participation, that occurs when all students have agency and they're empowered to actually contribute, not only in their learning, but in their school community and in their larger communities, in ways that are effectual, in ways that they feel like are meaningful to them. And then making sure that those high outcomes are solutions that benefit all students towards that self-determination. Remember, students have visions about where they often will have visions about what they want to do and be and where they see themselves going. And we have to make sure that we are aware of those and we're supporting those visions that students have and supporting, helping students cultivate visions as well. So when we think about this definition, we could say that centering equity and behavior systems occur when school systems are responsive of, constructed by, and responsive to all individuals within the school community, so that teams developing and implementing and monitoring PBIS are representative of multiple and diverse stakeholders and perspectives in ways that allows for meaningful participation in PBIS practices, and that those practices are culturally responsive and sustaining, and that we achieve high social behavior and academic outcomes for all students across group memberships. So when we think about what does that mean and how do we approach that, often people go right to disproportionality and want to look at that discipline outcome data. And that is really important. We need to understand that outcome data and make meaning of that. But we need to also understand that that's not the same as centering equity and behavior systems. It's just a small slice of that pie. We really have to begin to ask, what is it about our people and our practices and policies, as noted in your equity statement at the department level, contributing to the inequities that we are seeing? What is it about these systems? And then also, who is benefiting from the way things are and who's not? Constantly asking those questions in all conversations and all continuous improvement and all data review, always asking those questions as learning is being designed. Whose perspective is that lesson from? Who's going to benefit? We want to begin to think also about not only what we have to ask, but we have to be aware of the factors that contribute to inequitable racial discipline practices and outcomes. So I want to unpack that a little bit because there are factors that we need to be aware of. When we think about cultural mismatch really exists in schools because dominant culture is typically actually influencing all the functions across schools, and often unintentionally, the voices of historically marginalized children and families are not included. And when we think about that, when instructional methods and privileges methods privilege culture and language and practices and knowledge and abilities of dominant groups, they actually become barriers for students learning and their participation, and also serve as tools for assimilation into dominant school cultures. And so we have to think about that. And so cultural mismatch leads to subtractive schooling. And subtractive schooling really is a form of schooling that systematically strips historically marginalized students of their language, their culture, and their academic well-being through the assimilation to the dominant culture. And that's what I mean when I tell colleagues often I've had to give a lot up in order to be in this space today. And so think about that. We also want to be aware of deficit thinking and ideology. Deficit thinking really is around this inherent belief, whether it's explicit or implicit, that something is inherently wrong. It's often implicit, wrong with Black and Brown students and students with disabilities and students across other identity markers that have been marginalized. And some of the language that we hear when we talk about and identify deficit thinking, I've heard different things such as, when we're looking at discipline data, it's our students living in poverty. Poverty is a problem. If we could only change their lives at home or their home lives, their parents don't care. They don't care. If they could just get with the program. And I'm often intrigued by that, if you can just get with the program, because often that really makes me think about when we say get with the program, are we saying act like us, be like us? Are we saying assimilate into our ways of thinking and solving problems and communicating and interacting? We want to be thoughtful about that. I'm going to talk about a study I did in 2014 shortly that linked deficit model thinking about Black and Latinx students to scripting, labeling, and scapegoating, which were harmful practices that created very damaging narratives and harmful narratives about students of color, students with disabilities. So we want to talk about that, and also contributed to a negative school culture. Also, and I'm seeing here, cultural mismatch also has led to certain communities separating from public education entirely, which is so sad. We need to ask ourselves, how can we appreciate the gifts that each community, family, and students bring to our public ed? Thank you so much for that, Akiva. Absolutely. And I will share the article from answers to questions that was shared earlier. So we want to make sure we are also being aware that implicit bias is at work in all of us. We all have implicit bias, which are those attitudes and those stereotypes that affect our understandings and our actions and decisions in very unconscious ways. And when we're teaching about implicit bias in professional learning, we actually operationalize implicit so that people can know that this is not about pointing fingers or accusing anyone, because we inherited these systems of oppression. And so we have to think about how we're going to disrupt them, not feel like it's our fault that they were passed to us in the first place. That's not what this work is about. And so we want to make sure that we're thinking about that, because implicit racial bias really is a result of automatic preferences and automatic associations. There is a race association or implicit association test you can take. You can take it across different identities. But when you do that, well, one thing I've seen is that over 5 million people have taken that. And the research findings show that 70% of white people taking that test prefer white. 50% of Black people taking that test prefer white. So what we see is that there's an automatic white preference that is pervasive in our society. And so we're all impacted by that because of our social historical context. So we have to become aware of that and begin disrupting that. We also want to think about a factor that's harmful or that leads to inequitable outcomes, and that's a heavy gaze on outcome data. Thus the title, Shifting Our Gaze, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. We're so wanting to know how our students are doing that we're constantly keeping our eye on that outcome data, which is critical. However, what we have to do is think about how that might cause us to focus on fixing students and how that might lead to other harmful practices, and how we have to begin to think about other types of data that we need to be looking at to understand the outcome data that we're seeing. And so I want to unpack really quickly some harmful practices and conditions from that 2014 study specific to behavior system practices. And so you're going to see that scripting is showing up on your screen and labeling. And scripting really refers to how identities of Black and Brown students who've been marginalized, are socially constructed within schools, when ideas and beliefs and mental representations of those social interactions become practices of habit in terms of reality and practice within social systems, that students become the behaviors that they're being called. Students become the ideas behind those behaviors in the minds of people, and then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Scapegoating is a direct consequence of scripting and labeling. And what happens is that as students their identities are socially constructed in negative ways through the scripting and labeling, they become easy targets for other students and even adults to be able to use them as a scapegoat when an issue arises, knowing that merely mentioning their name will get them off the hook. And so we have to be thinking about how is that happening and how do we disrupt that? And then making majors out of minors. And this happens when students of color and students with disabilities and students who are from minoritized groups actually are frequently referred to the office for minor behaviors or for culturally nuanced behaviors that could be managed by staff, redirected, or understood in ways to increase engagement. These practices are subtle, but they are harmful, and they lead to silencing, falsely accusing, and additional punitive practices. And they really adversely affect students' self-perception, the peer relations that they have, their behaviors, and their experiences in schools. In fact, students in that 2014 study had some things to say about these practices. They were sharing that when they were scripted and labeled, that they felt angry, sad, frustrated, unliked, and as if they could do nothing right. And with regard to scapegoating, they felt silenced, angry, frustrated, unliked, hopeless, misunderstood, treated unfairly, and beside themselves with disbelief. And students also shared feeling picked on and singled out and frustrated, unliked and disconnected. And so we can learn from hearing from our students, and we can integrate what practices based on what we're learning. In addition to practices and behavior systems, there are 6 areas that the national data in which your states are part of that talks about inequitable learning conditions that students of color face. Students of color and other students, they face a lack of access to quality instruction and resources. We know from the Department of Education, the US Department of Education data, that schools serving mostly students of color have lower quality or fewer resources than schools serving largely white populations. Even within the same district, sometimes this happens. We know that they also, another inequitable learning condition is access to advanced courses. I can tell you, I was an administrator at the district and building level for 10 years, and I saw across 2 districts the kids who were entering into advanced courses and gifted and talented programs, and even the top 10 kids every year, they always look the same. And as I would look around the room, I would wonder, does anyone notice that? And how do we begin to address that? And our national data also shows us that schools serving more students of color are less likely to offer advanced courses and gifted and talented programs than schools serving mostly white students. And that Black students with high math performance in 5th grade are unlikely to be in placed in algebra in 8th grade. And so we want to think about these conditions in which students are learning. We also know that students of color don't have access to rigorous course work targeted at grade appropriate standards in the same ways, and that they also often are exposed to texts and literature and curricular resources that don't have the accurate representation of their cultures and their lived experiences, like I shared earlier, and that they lack access to experienced and stable teaching workforces when they're in schools that are in disinvested communities, and that access to related services and supports are also one that we have to think about, because students of color are more likely to attend schools with resource officers, but not school counselors, which are critical. School counselors are critical to supporting the implementation of PBIS and all other school-wide systems and supporting students in navigating those systems. So every system is perfectly designed to get the results that it does. So we have to really begin to think about, if we're going to look at our outcome data and understand how our students are performing, which has been our traditional way of doing things, and look at that fidelity data to think about, are we implementing our behavior systems and other systems with integrity? We have to also ask ourselves, can we shift that gaze and begin to look at systems data and really begin to understand what is the context in which students are learning and teachers are teaching? And how are we implementing systems of support with integrity? And also, are these conditions equitable? And then we can look at our outcome data to see if our inputs that we're putting into our systems are lending themselves to the outcomes. And that shifts us from focusing on fixing students to actually supporting and fixing systems where there are inadequacies. The Midwest and Plains Equity Assistance Center provides guidance on supporting that type of thinking and work. And so this graphic that you see here, and that's also in your handouts, provides you with ways of looking at those 4 constructs of equity. If you look across the top of the screen, you see access, representation, meaningful participation, and positive outcomes. But you also can see that there are some reflection questions that your team can ask. What do we already know? How do we know it? What types of data can help us know to help us with what we need to know? And then also, can we leverage existing data structures or systems to collect that data? And so then you can start looking at these other system components and asking questions around who's benefiting from the way things are and who's not, looking at disaggregated data to see who's accessing and faring well through these different experiences, and then begin to make shifts in the input to actually support the outcomes that we're seeing. And so that's what we're doing in the field of PBIS. We're expanding the work that we're doing to consider issues of racial disproportionality, equity, and bias, but also learning what it means to create culturally sustaining PBIS systems. And so when we think about what does it mean to be culturally responsive and sustaining, we want to make sure that those practices base curriculum and teaching and learning on cultural linguistic realities of students, that come into that are a part of our spaces and the schools that are situated in the communities that they serve. And we have to view those realities as assets. We want to preserve and encourage linguistic, literate, and cultural pluralism by sustaining in-group cultural practices and cross-group cultural practices. And this is work from Dr. Paris and Aline. And also reflect and support communities' language and cultural practices in ways that are both traditional, but also evolving. So how do we do that? I'm going to just quickly walk through. These all could be professional learning sessions to unpack each one of these, but I want to expose you to these because I know that Mr. Love's going to come and share some ways that they're engaging in this work back in their district. So we want to create culturally sustaining systems. And by doing that, we want to make sure that we're engaging in these different types of practices. We want to really make sure we're engaging in critical self-examination of self. We want to engage in examination and interrogation of our systems, getting back to who's benefiting from how things are and who is not, and understanding that across different identity groups and markers. Also moving into action, taking what we're learning and putting it into action. And some of those ways would involve implementing culturally sustaining practices in school systems and also job-embedded equity-focused professional learning. Some things to think about is that there are multiple entry points into doing this work. While you see arrows going in one direction, they could go into multiple directions. The next iteration would display that wherever you start, you just have to make sure you're engaging in all of these over time. So let's quickly unpack a few of these. Critical self-examination really involves getting into identity work. We have to understand who we are, how our worldviews have been shaped, how our different and intersecting identities carry multiple points of either marginalization and oppression or power and privilege, and how that impacts the work that we do. We have to think about how our identities position us in places of power or places of further marginalization, and how that plays out in the decisions we make and how we see our families and students and interact. We have to also be aware of implicit racial bias. We have to unpack power and privilege, because understanding implicit racial bias is not enough. We have to understand how power and privilege are operating that might advantage some while disadvantaging others. And then we have to really be aware of deficit thinking. With regards to examining our systems, as we look at ourselves, we're also looking at our systems. We're asking, what are the systemic inequities as we engage in continuous improvement, as we're engaging in data review? We're asking, what is it about our people, our practices, and our policies that's contributing to the inequities that we see in our systems? And we're also asking, how is implicit and explicit racial bias contributing to those systemic inequities? As you can see, when we ask these questions, it shifts our gaze from looking at our students in ways that might be harmful to them, and looking at our systems and our practices. And then how is power and privilege maintaining inequitable experiences for marginalized students? Then we want to implement culturally sustaining practices and policies in our schools. We want to make sure we're engaging in equity-oriented strategic planning, because what happens at the district level and even what happens at the state level impacts all the way down into the classroom. So what are those strategic plans? What are those policies, and how are we reviewing them to make sure we're removing practices that are harmful? We want to center equity in our PBIS systems and our continuous improvement process. We want to involve multiple and diverse stakeholders. This is critical to the work, and systems implementation and decision-making. And we want to engage in hiring practices and resource allocation that's actually supportive of the vision of the district, the vision of the building, the vision at the state level, but also that people are going to come on knowing that they are committed to engaging in this equity work. They don't have to have all the answers, but they have to be willing to do this work and willing to see the inequities where they are. And then we want to implement cultural sustaining curriculum, resources, and instruction and practices. And so we have used a lot of the tools from the National TA Center, PBIS TA Center. And so I just wanted to put these on the screen. They're also in your handout. And the reason why is because that 5-point intervention approach for enhancing equity really helps us to think about, we cannot enter into equity work from one strategy. We have to engage and have a multi-component plan and approach in order to do this work. And then the TA Center also has guides and tools to support how do you actually put PBIS culturally responsiveness practices into place within your PBIS systems. And how do you have conversations about race and racism as you're engaging in that work and other forms of oppression? And then also what I learned through the pilot work we did here in Michigan around centering equity in PBIS, was a 7-year journey, was that we needed additional tools to support growing and increasing the capacity of our school leadership teams and our principals and administrators to lead for equity. And so the Midwest and Plains Equity Assistance Center, and there are other centers out there as well, they have on their website a plethora of tools and resources to support learning and assessing systems to make sure that they're supportive of all students. And then we need to engage in, as I come to a close, job embedded professional development. We want to look at our social historical context, structural racism. We want to make sure we're getting learning on that, because if we don't understand how we got to where we are, it's difficult to disrupt those things. It also helps us to know that we inherited these things, and that in our generation, it's our challenge and our task to begin and continue to disrupt those things that we inherited. We want to get learning around and ongoing cultivating critical awareness, and that involves understanding how implicit bias, power and privilege and identity are at work in our systems. We want to increase our cultural competency, make sure we're competent in more than one culture. And then we want to make sure that we're engaging culturally sustaining and relevant practices. And so I wanted to highlight that this work is possible. It's possible to narrow those gaps and to center equity in school. This is one pilot partner that we worked with here in the Midwest area, where you can see on the data here several things. The line graph really shows annual rates, and it's the result of a 3-year process with one particular school. You see the annual rates of major discipline referrals by subgroup. In 2015-16, you can see there that was pre-pilot. And so you can see a pronounced discipline gap, right? And so when we look between our Black and white students, the red line represents our African-American students, the blue line represents our white students. By the end of the 3-year pilot, this particular partner decreased their discipline gap between their white and Black students from 3.95 to 0.43, according to their annual rate of major office referrals by their subgroup data. And during the same time, they also were able to decrease, and forgive me for going so quickly, their discipline gap not only decreased, but they reduced their overall referrals for all students from 5,930 referrals to 1,235 referrals. And so they not only narrowed their gap, but they also decreased their overall office referrals. And so what that told them was, this work is good for all students. And they didn't see it as, why are we just focusing on any one group? They saw it as centering equity in our work is good for all students. And if you can see in that language there, you can see that some of the professional learning not only included the cultural responsiveness work and those guides that you saw in the previous slides, but we also focused on making sure we were implementing and training on neutralizing routines. And so really quickly, I want to share 2 of those strategies, the stop and try. They really help to neutralize when we're most vulnerable, because research is showing that we are most likely to act out of implicit bias when we when we have vulnerable decision points. We're hungry, the room is too cold, a lot of things are going on that we haven't been able to address. And so the try is a strategy that you can use before you make a decision, a disciplined decision, where you take a deep breath, you reflect on your emotions, you keep the student's best interest in your mind, and you think about ways to maybe try it again, or try it in a different way, or try to see how we might do it at school as we're redirecting a student in a situation. And then the stop is stopping your unconscious response, taking mindful breaths to self-regulate, observing how you are feeling, and then proceed positively by doing what's most effective. And again, you can read all about this in those handouts and those guides that you have as a part of this presentation that can help you think about how you might use these. But it's important to know that these practices are part of a multi-component approach to enhance equity within PBIS, and that these strategies are not meant to be used separate from the approach. And what I really like about the strategies is that it gives adults something tangible to do and enact while working to cultivate critical consciousness, which takes time and is ongoing. And so, I've seen through practice, other educators really appreciate that. So I want to thank you for your time and hand things over to Mr. Love.
Thank you, Dr. Pino-Simmons. Wow, that's so fascinating to me. And I love those strategies of stop and try. I feel like I can use them in my life anyway. We did have a question in the chat talking about like the discipline data and how it went up over all of those years. What's causing the racial discipline disparities to worsen over time, do you think? You have oh, you're muted. Sorry.
Thank you. Such a really good question. So again, I think those things that were unpacked earlier around not being aware that we all have implicit bias and acting from our automatic preference without knowing it. When curriculum doesn't match the lived experience, when we're asking students to check their identities at the door, there are a lot of inputs that we can address in our school systems that can actually create more culturally responsive and sustaining experiences for students that would decrease the types of decisions that we're seeing, because students don't usually resist learning. I haven't met a young person yet who isn't always wondering about something, but they resist schools that they feel are non-responsive. And it could be that the adults are doing everything they can to be responsive, because I know I've met a teacher or an educator yet who doesn't care about kids and are in this for all the right reasons. I think we just are learning. And as Maya Angelou says, as we know better, then we can do better.
Mhm. Awesome. Well, we have had some questions in chat. If you'd like to continue to ask questions of Dr. Pano-Simmons, we have that Q&A function, and that'll be going on. But I'm going to share some slides here. Next up, we have Jonathan Love, and he's going to talk about what this looks like on the ground. So Jonathan's a school counselor who has been focused on systems work at Clover Park's Thomas Middle School, and he's previously worked in the Franklin Pierce School District. So Jonathan, welcome. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your experience?
Yeah, well, I'm really excited to be here. It's going to be really tough to follow up with everything that Dr. Ruthie Pano-Simmons had talked about. That's a lot to unpack. So first, I think it's important to kind of get an idea of what my lens looks like and all the different implicit biases that were built in with those experiences. Do I have a PowerPoint? Oh, there we go. Okay. So a little bit about my background is I'm a counselor at Dr. Claudia Thomas Middle School, which used to be Woodbrook Middle School. I am trained in restorative practices as a trainer, as well as Second Step, and worked in an MTSS system for 9 years. And actually, that's probably my better strength. I've been lucky enough, and I know there are two other people here today calling them out, Shauna Jacobs and Laura Conklin, that I've had the pleasure of tagging along with them at the ASCA National Conferences, presenting on how we've applied multi-tier systems of support to increase equity. And my principal, who empowered us to do that, I guess, is also here. And so there was some amazing work that got done there, and I'm sure they have a lot of gray hairs from working with me. So 7 years as a middle school counselor and 7 years as a high school counselor. And I've been on the building equity team for our district for the last 3 years. And I've asked to be off of it 2 years in a row. And they keep saying, no, we want to have you keep doing it. I'm like, oh, and that advocacy takes a lot of energy out of you. So if we go to the next slide, which kind of gives a lot of context for the lens that I grew up in. My parents were in the military, and they had 4 kids. And so I lived in Germany, Maryland, Texas, Alabama, which is not on there, which was a real experience, in Anniston, Alabama. And there's a lot of history in Alabama, especially Anniston. And then also in Korea. My favorite thing to do in the world is to sit on my porch and drink a soda. So I'm not a really exciting person. I grew up in the Clover Park School District. I started in 6th grade, which was actually elementary school, and went to Lockburn Junior High School at the time, and then Clover Park High School. And then I planned to go in the military, and that did not happen. Nobody would take me in the military because of physical issues that I had. So I wound up doing 2 years of a missionary service and coming back, teaching in Korea. But it's important to understand for me where that lens is and being able to kind of pull apart the implicit biases I grew up with. Now, if you look at that picture, the pictures of me, I did cheerleading, wrestling, water polo. And if you look at that picture, you see a lot of diverse faces. Now, in addition to that, like I was on a wrestling team, only 2 white people on that wrestling team. All the way through Lockburn and Clover Park High School, we never, ever had a white ASB representative, ever. And in fact, my ASB president still works in our district as an educator. And I'm really blessed that that's David Smith, if he's here, he's probably not here. Really blessed that he has always been really bold and open and a great friend in helping me see implicit biases that I grew up with. And one of the disadvantages that I had growing up is I went to school in this very diverse population, and I made assumptions that what I was experiencing in that environment, because it was a diverse population, was the same experience everyone else I was growing up with had. And as I got older and I get to have conversations with my classmates, you know, it's shocking to hear the disparity in experiences they've had despite being the exact same environment I was in. And those are important things to learn and know about yourself, but also know about them. So it's really important to understand your own narrative. All right, we can go to the next one. So when we're talking about, you know, welcome to perfection, enjoying the journey, it's always a journey. The perfection is being on the journey itself. So the first thing I think when you're working on this journey and working towards equity in your building is having a good idea of where you are right now. Like, who are you? What values do you have? And there's some activities that we've actually done in our district that have been really helpful that we'll go into a little bit more as we talk, dissect and break down what our district is currently doing. Where do you want to be? And if you're in a state of burnout, obviously you're probably not looking down the road. You're probably going, well, this is all I can handle right now. What are some of the things that you need? What plans does your district have, and what are resources that you have access to? And one of the big growing pieces when you start getting to what are your needs, what are your plan, and what are your resources, is understanding that that is very fluid. It changes depending on who you have on your team. When you have new members of your staff come in or new members of your team, they don't necessarily have the same skill set. So expecting to be able to accomplish the same tasks the same way is not a reality. So really getting into an idea of like what their narrative is, who they are, and what they have to contribute, they might have more powerful ways of accomplishing the same task that you have laid out in front of you. All right, so that's a big piece is understanding all those key components. And that is a lot of what we're doing in our school district, is getting a good idea of where we are, discussing as our staff in our buildings where we want to be. And now we're at a point where we've already gone through our needs last year, and this year is a lot about implementing plans, and we're starting to identify resources that we need. All right, we can move forward to the next one. So this is one of the activities. Kefi, do you know, is the survey after this slide or at this slide?
We can put it out now, whenever you want.
Why don't we put it on now? Because I think it leads up to this. So we're gonna put a survey up, and all of the district building reps, district equity building reps did this activity. And the question to ask, and it's probably worded a little bit differently when you see it, is based off of the original intent of the Constitution, where do you feel we are as a country on the founding goals of that document? And I think there's 4 scales, like 1 to 25 being low. Oh, there we go. So regarding equity, where would you rate our country? Now, this is in the context of the intention of the Constitution. So go ahead and put your input in there. Now, we did this as equity team leaders in our district. And me and my coworker, Monica Brinker, amazing dean, who's also a Black female. And she has so much passion, and sometimes I always marvel at like how she can keep that level of energy. Now, as you're, I don't know if I can see what the ratings are, but you can kind of process where you feel we're at. And me and Brinker, we were sitting at about 85%. And after we did this activity, we actually decided not to do it in our building because evaluating where our staff was emotionally at the time. And there are a lot of things that go into how you view this question. So one of those things is like, what is your life lens? What has your experiences been that make you believe, either it's in a good state or it's not a good state? And then also, what is your locus of control? So if you believe that you don't have a great ability to affect change, then really we haven't moved very far along. So right, and that's kind of where our staff was. The reason why we decided not to do this in our building is, instead of it being something that brought us together, what we found was people on polarizing ends, even in that training, were pointing the finger, seeing each other as the problem. And we felt like this is a good activity to do, but in our building, we were not ready for that, for everyone to kind of self-evaluate. Why do you believe that we're in that place? What we actually did all agree on was we didn't like where we were. Regardless of where you felt you were on the continuum, none of us liked where we were. A lot of it was just an evaluation of, your ability to advocate and create change. So based off our experience on that, this was the other activity that we did find was very beneficial for our staff, which was exploring and sharing personal cultures. And a lot of this has to do with what your personal narrative is. And so in each of the boxes, what we did is we wrote down how we would rank these from 1 to 9. How would you look different? How would that look different for each person? So after we did this, we self-reflected, and then we were asked to take one away. If you could take one away that you did, that wasn't most important or salient to you, which one would you take away? And we kept doing that until you had not just ranked 1 to 9, but, and there should be like 3 others that didn't show up in that image, is sharing in groups. What was our number 1? Like, what did you have? Like, obviously, different people would have chose different things to be a defining characteristic of who they were. Maybe it was language, maybe it's race and ethnicity, or your choices, or your religion, and how that was different for every person, and why it was different for every person. What experiences in their life made them grab onto that identifying descriptor more than anything else. And that allowed us to look at everyone and try to be able to empathize with the lens that they were in. That was incredibly beneficial and impactful in our staff meeting. And then we took that same activity and that trickled down into our advisory curriculum, where our students did that. So for my class, we always use community circles. And so what we did was, Monica Brinker did a whole lesson on doing double donuts or doing different complex instructions. So I was like, well, she taught it, so we might as well use it, right? So we did a double donut. And so we had one group that was sharing these, and then the inside circle was asking questions. And it allowed us to kind of share where different people were, and allowing us to understand that we're not all at the same point, and we view things with a different lens. So that was a really powerful example of things that we are doing in our district that started at the top of the district that trickled all the way down to our students. Okay, next slide. There we go. Oh, wait, there we go. Okay, so some of the questions are like, how do we define equity and inclusion in our district? And so these are just basic descriptions, right? Which is, inclusion is, do students feel welcome in your building? Do they see, are they seen? Are they, there should be another word in there, which is heard, which is the one that we're using in our district, that we see you, that we hear you, that you're respected and understood, and that they feel cared for and safe in our building. Now, when we're talking about equity, we're talking about educational disparities, like what people have access to, how are they labeled, who is getting sent to the office, how we're looking at positive school outcomes, things like that. And our district is currently in the process of building multi-tier systems of support, so MTSS. And that is a whole system that embodies positive behavioral support. It embodies our school-wide expectations, which is also built into positive behavioral support, our restorative practices, our advisory curriculum, all those things that you do to make sure that students are successful. And as we build that multi-tier systems of support, you start seeing some of these disparities. And it's important for us And I'm going to use a phrase stolen from Dr. Ruthie Payno Simmons, which is interrogate these processes, which is, I enjoy that term better, or I feel it's more applicable because it implies having an uncomfortable conversation. And they're usually not comfortable conversations. So really interrogating the process that kind of got that outlier to happen. And so I want to provide some of the examples of what those look like. So one of the ones that I've had the experience before at a different middle school, before I worked at high school, was we had a multi-tier systems of support program. And we were noticing that every student referred to the office was Black female, like every single one from the same class. And I was fortunate enough at the time to have a coworker, Sonia Amwa Forson, who was Black female and one of the first students to attend school in the state of Arkansas with police escort. So her life lens and her wisdom was invaluable. And so I did go to her and to ask questions. And I brought a lot of information with me because I wanted to ask some cultural context questions. And so she did ask me questions like, who is being referred? Why were they being referred? What did the information in the referral say? And so what we found was every student being referred was being referred for disruption of classroom, just disruption. And so when we started interviewing some of those students, what we found was they weren't, and the teacher, there was no use of profanity. There was no threats to other students. In fact, their language was on topic conversation. What made them disruptive in the classroom was the volume that they were using. That was it. And as I talked to Ms. Sonia Forson, what she elaborated to me was, as a Black female growing up, you realize men got the right to vote first, then Black females got the right to vote. So when you think of marginalized population and you talk about voice means many different things. Voice could be your ability to advocate for people to listen to you. And so what happens is if you're in a culture where people don't listen to you, then what happens is you just become louder. And so that's what she shared with me. And so, the process is like, I don't need to create a group with that group of students to create a new narrative that they need to get with the system, right? Because they were engaged learners. So that information was taken to our administrators, which led to having the conversation with that teacher about cultural awareness and responding to that. So that's one great example of how multi-tier systems of support can directly affect students in a positive way and balancing out these disparities. Another one, which is more recent as we're starting to learn, is we realized that in our building, our majority population of our students are Hispanic. And a lot of those parents don't speak English. So we really put a lot of effort into having a new student parent orientation night, all in Spanish. And thank you, Google Translate. And we have people in our building who also helped translate that, but we did a whole parent night in Spanish and the attendance was very, very low. And again, challenging stereotypes, like the first assumption could have been, well, they're not invested in education, right? Or it wasn't important to them. But, again, interrogate the processes that we have. And some of the things that turned out is, one, was our invitation to those families in Spanish? Well, if they're not in Spanish, then, we're just compounding the problem. The other one was in our district, we have a technology issue. A lot of these homes don't necessarily have access, and we were all in a virtual environment. So the expectation that, we're knowing we have a low income population, that they were all going to be able to have access to streaming technology and be able to attend, right, might not have been the case. And so how could we have worked around that? And so it was a step in the right, the direction. But again, like equity is that journey. It's not like a destination where it's like, well, we did the parent night in Spanish, so we've already arrived to that. and then I think the other slide, if we want to move forward, and I'm going to give, I do want to give one more example of that before I hit some of these other ones. A lot of times also, because I know we have a lot of school counselors out here, and there's a lot of different therapeutic approaches, and different counselors are trained in different therapeutic approaches. I haven't got a text on how much time I have. But one of the most common techniques for school counselors to use is a solution-focused approach. And so if you're familiar with restorative practices, that's a lot of what we would use. I would challenge you to use, to add to that, some narrative practices with that, which is scaffolding the context of that person's experience. Because a lot of times what will happen is we get to that solution focused approach, and we're asking questions like, well, what would make it better? What did you want to happen? How is this going to be better in the future? Versus understanding how the student got to that point to begin with. And we have teachers now who've embraced doing restorative conferences rather than like a step 4 conference or a parent teacher conference. And so one of the great examples we had of that just 2 weeks ago, a student being willing to do that, and the teacher, is the student needed to leave the class because they needed to go to the nurse's office because she was experiencing a period and needed to be able to leave, and felt like she was called out because the teacher didn't respond right away. And so it was a very uncomfortable situation for both of them. The teacher's view was different than the student's view, but they were both willing to do a narrative conference or a restorative conference. And so when you go through that process and you scaffold that experience for the student, that student had a lot of cultural family issues happening in the home. And the student elaborated on that before we got to it. And explaining, how the parents were stressed out about her homework, and then her dog went into the emergency room that morning. Then she was late for school. And so you have all these compounding factors, and now she's in class, her attention span's short, her mind is other places, and that directly affects her experience. None of these things the teacher knows, right? They're not aware of them. And you don't necessarily get to that narrative if we're all like, well, what could have made it better? What do we need to do in the future? And so that was helpful for the teacher to be able to hear those different things that happened before the student got there. It did allow us to have conversations about, what's another way, because we have signs in our classrooms for positive behavioral support school-wide expectation. If you need to go to the bathroom, then you hold your hand up like this. If you have a question that's off, they have a lot of hand gestures. So what do we have that's a nonverbal to tell the teacher that I need to go to the nurse's office and I need to go now? And that's one of those things that we just don't have addressed in our building that came up in that meeting. It allows us to close the gap. Okay, now I think we're on the last slide. And I think it's in the Q&A section, but I do want to touch on it because we have a lot of staff members that are at this point and working through it, which is how do you avoid burnout, which can be very, very difficult. And I was meeting with my coworker this morning, and we were having a conversation about what does burnout look like and what is attributed to that. And when you feel like you've advocated and you've hit a ceiling, right, and you're not getting anywhere with it, you can become frustrated, you become apathetic, you start just doing the bare bones of your job. Well, I'm going to come in when I'm supposed to get paid, and I'm going to do the bare essentials, and I'm going to leave, right? And that's the worst thing that can happen for us, is to be in that stage of apathy, especially when we've hit that ceiling, we don't understand why we hit it. And my coworker looked at me and she goes, "You just described where I've been for the last 7 years." And I'm like, "Oh, that's horrible," right? Like, that's not where we want to be. We want to be able to continue to advocate. And knowing where the ceiling is and why the ceiling is there is so important, because it allows us to know, okay, what do we need to, what's the next step for us? And understanding what those are. Right now, we're in the middle of SBA testing. We really feel that's inequitable for a lot of our students, for a number of different reasons, because our access to technology is very different. And no matter how much we tell our admin, this is not something that's equitable for all of our kids, that is attached to funding for our district. So that's not really a negotiable. And so understanding like the implications of that, also being a low income student, no low income district, a lot of our funding is subsidized because funding is not equitable across the state. So a lot of our funding comes through grants. Well, grants come with requirements. And requirements means there's certain things that we have to do, which sometimes doesn't allow us to be as free as we would like to be with our curriculum. And embedding diversity in our curriculum is important. And I had a picture earlier that had like all the important women in our culture on there. And so understanding how much, even those systems impact our ability to provide what our students need. And there's so many factors that go into systems of inequity. And so, yes, I think I'm at the 5-minute mark, but I really want to be able to kind of end. And I'm really thankful that I got to share some of this journey that we're in our district, and a lot of the stuff that's coming from our district office from Grant Twyman, he's our district and equity coordinator. And a lot of the work that they're doing, pulling leadership students out of our buildings, diverse leadership students, and making sure that they're seen, making sure that they're heard, responding to them, making adjustments in the buildings. We're starting to integrate those students into our Tier 1 MTSS meetings as we move forward so that they can have voice along with our parents. So there's a lot of great work that's happening. It's slow, it's painful, a lot of times it's very uncomfortable. A lot of conversations that I've had have been very uncomfortable for me, being a white male, needing to be able to process and step back and understand that just because the way that I viewed it is not necessarily the way that everybody else viewed it, and being able to open to other people's viewpoints. But yes, I really appreciate being here and being able to share. Everyone that's here is really doing a lot of wonderful work. And I've got to meet with Dr. Ruthie Payno-Simmons 2 or 3 times. And so I'm the most blessed person here, and also with the people of OSPI. So thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Yeah, I know this year has been just so tough for people, and thinking about the systems where we're all just struggling through. And, like there's obvious places where it's like, wow, we could do something about this. And that retooling for, I think, a lot of schools has come up because the things that you've always done before aren't necessarily covering all of the need out there right now. And just being flexible and giving people, give people grace to rethink. And it's an opportunity for that painful growing and rebirth, that we all could use right now, for sure. Yes, so we did want to talk a little bit about some resources, but before we go to that, we do hope that some of the ideas that you heard today are worth sharing, maybe with your leadership team or your PLC, or maybe that you'll even get to discuss them with some students. So we want to challenge you to have a discussion and follow up this webinar, and keep it in your mind today and as you go through your work this week. We do have some resources that are helpful. A lot of people have ESSER dollars available to do things, but we also have a document called Unlocking Federal and State Program Funds to Support Student Success. So if you're trying to find some extra cash to do the cool stuff that needs to get done, you should check out that document. We also have some tools. We have recently launched our new newsletter. It's called Engage, and we hope y'all will read and subscribe to that. We have articles from education leaders that are timely, as well as tools and other cool stuff. So we also have, Dua, do you want to talk a little bit about this PBIS interview?
The Center on PBIS, is that?
Yeah.
Oh.
Ron Denise?
Yeah, so the Center of PBIS is a resources that we often use. It's just a website, but they have a bunch of resources on there that you can definitely check out. They also have PDF files that you can also look at as well. And they especially have, as part of our care package, the PBIS Cultural Responsiveness Field Guide, resources for trainers and coaches. So if you go on there, or we can even attach it onto here too. Actually, I will just attach it onto here.
Thanks, Dua.
Yes, that's the field guide that we often use. I believe Dr. Pano Simmons also included that as part of her resources as well. So really lean on that because it could definitely break down what cultural responsiveness is and how to incorporate it into your curriculum and your school-wide practices.
Nice. I also included in here, there's a classroom management self-assessment. And so as you're out teaching or supporting teachers this fall, it's a good just back to basics self-check on how it's going and some opportunities for growth. We also have a connect with OSPI staff button. So if we don't know the answer, we can connect you with someone who does. So I hope that y'all will take advantage of that as well. And we have a couple of questions.
And Dr. Ruthie Pano Simmons, she has her hand up virtually.
Oh, okay. Go ahead, Dr. Ruthie.
Sure, thank you so much. Just in the spirit of sharing resources, I will provide the team here with some links to some actual sessions that we did for the PBIS forum that actually goes through and unpack actual applicable strategies related to the talk today. And so that people can go through them on their own time, and it has resources linked and handouts linked. So I'll share those so that you have them.
Rock on. Yes. Some resources there too. Next month, we are going to be talking about Lifelines, a comprehensive approach to suicide prevention for schools. We've got Maureen Underwood with us, who is an author and a trainer for that. And we think it will be just such a great show. So we hope that you can join us for that. And we'll put a link in the chat if you want to invite a friend to come along as well. We are going to launch our evaluation. And just so that you know, we always look at our evaluations and we love to get your feedback. We have a longer form one if you want to tell us things that go beyond a multiple choice question. So that's available on our webpage as well. We always like to use your feedback to improve our webinars, and we really do believe in continuous improvement. So the fact that this show is still going 7 years later is thanks to you and to all of that feedback that you have graciously given us. For people listening out there, we do offer clock hours for joining us. So if you're planning to get those clock hours, it's an hour and a half available. If you're watching the recording, you just need to take our feedback survey and we can award you clock hours for that as well. So we'll verify your attendance and you should have a confirmation back early next week. And we appreciate our audience. Thanks so much for joining us today. Thank you to our speakers. You're amazing and your work is just very inspiring. So thanks all, and we'll see you next month.